basically what I asked is how you feel about automatic bids. So the automatic bids situation is the one that is creating the most angst. And that's the one, it would be the biggest change if they end up making it. And I think they're kind of headed down that path. And basically what we laid out is what they're kicking around. Ross Dellinger wrote about this on Sunday. You've seen this in other places over the last few months. When Joel Klatt was on with us, he laid it out. And look, Joel works for Fox. They work closely with the conference executives. Trust me, this was all rolled out in a way to become digestible. So basically, I did a poll and I said, what would you rather have for college football playoff selection? So they're talking about a 14 or 16 team field. I think they're going to expand it. So I think we can, I know people want to argue, oh, move it back to 8, go back to, okay, that's not happening. They're going to probably expand it. At the very least, it's going to stay at 12, but they're probably going to add 2 or 4 spots. So let's go assuming that it's going to be a 14 or 16 team format. A lot of automatic bids. So what they've talked about is 4 Big 10, 4 SEC, 2 ACC, 2 Big 12. The highest ranked champion of the other conferences, I'm not going to say group of 5 because the Pac-12 is going to be back. I don't know if it's going to have 12 teams, but it's going to be back. So that would be another spot. So if you have 14 spots, that's 13 of them taken up. You'd have 1 at-large bid. If Notre Dame's in the top 14, they would be in. If it's a 16-team format, you would have 3 at-large bids. If Notre Dame's in the top 16, it would get 1 of those, and then the other 2 would go to somebody else. The next option is status quo, but with more teams. So if you have 14 teams, then 5 automatic bids. The 5 highest ranked conference champs automatically get in. Now we can tweak the seeding later. We can worry about the seeding, and the seeding may actually get tweaked earlier. But the 5 highest ranked conference champs get in, and then you'd have 9 at-large spots. If you had a 16-team format, you'd have 11 at-large spots. The other option I threw out there is you just have at-large spots. You take the top 14 or the top 16. Most people want either all at-larges or 5 automatic bids and mostly at-larges. Only 18%. We had about 3,400 votes at this point. You can still go on my Twitter, Andy_Staples, and vote. You've got about 11 and a half hours left to vote. But the numbers have tracked pretty consistently since we started the poll. 4/5 of the audience, more than 4/5 of the audience. And I get that these are probably more hardcore college football fans. The Fox and ESPN executives probably trying to reach the more casual ones. But I think this is a pretty good representative slice of people who really do watch the games, who are the target audience. 4/5 of them hate this idea. Hate the idea of having all these at-large bids. And I got to admit, I found it very interesting because that's not what I expected. I expected a more even split. And we talked about it yesterday with Ari, and Ari made the point of keep college football weird. And one of the ways you keep college football weird is you do entrust a committee of 13 people with the selection of the postseason. Say, okay, here you go. You have some parameters, but it's not completely tied down. Go pick some teams, which is weird and causes a lot of arguments. Gives us a lot to talk about. All the auto bids, much more similar to the NFL. The NFL has wild cards, but a very strict way of populating the playoff. You either win your division or you have one of the best records beneath that, and you get a wild card spot. And sometimes you get teams that you don't feel like should be in the playoff because they have weak divisions some years. Sometimes you have exceptionally strong divisions where most of the wild cards come from. But it is pretty much set in stone. And that's how it's going to be. And I was under the assumption, before I did this little informal poll, that there were a lot more of you guys who wanted a set parameter that you wanted to know going into the season how many each league was going to get in, like you wanted a more objective criteria. I think that's the phrase I heard the most over the years. Why is it so subjective? Why can't you have an objective criteria? Well, this would be objective criteria. Sort of. Not really. Josh Pate, who hosts a show as well, he responded to me. He said the auto bids will receive the least amount of votes, but given the expanded format, actually be the best solution, which I thought there would be more of you that agreed with Josh on this. And here's where Josh is coming from. And I'll tell you right now, this is probably bad YouTubing, bad interneting, bad podcasting. I don't have a very strong opinion one way or another on this. I think I've been beaten down. I think I used to have obviously very strong opinions on what the playoffs should look like. I think I've been beaten down and become very cynical. Like they're just going to do what they're going to do and they don't care what we think anyway. So what does it matter? So I'm more looking at this more almost like an anthropologist. Like, okay, if you chose this, here's what the pros and cons would be. And if you chose this, here's what the pros and cons would be. Because at this point, I feel like they're going to do what they're going to do. They've already, like, the Big Ten and the SEC have consolidated so much power. They just don't care. Raymond, Josh is an SEC super homer. I'm going to explain why that's not really the opinion an SEC super homer would give in a second. I got to tell you about Panini America, the most collectible sports cards on the planet. It's so cool now because you can collect college players in their college uniforms. Your favorite NFL players, you can get them when they were in college. And so we were opening packs this week. Just this week, I pulled this Cooper DeJean autograph. He's in his Iowa uniform. This is before the pick six in the Super Bowl was a gleam in his eye. But now he's one of the hottest players in the country and got his autograph with his Iowa uniform. Got this Brilliance out of 99 J.J. McCarthy in his Michigan uniform. He's going to be QB1 for the Vikings this year. It's going to be electric. And then I love this one. I love this one. Tavondre Sweat autograph. Because they're not as big on doing the linemen, but Tavondre is awesome. If you're a longtime listener to the show, you remember when Tavondre came on. How do you not love that guy? And he's playing great for the Titans now, but he was awesome at Texas. And then you've got the guys that haven't actually hit it big in college yet, but could. So we got a Julian Sayin card that I pulled out of a pack a few months ago. Julian Sayin is potentially QB1 at Ohio State. Not yet, but we'll see. And so that's what it's bringing me back to it because I loved collecting cards when I was a kid, but I was always a big college football fan. I wanted college football cards and couldn't get them. Panini has them. So visit PaniniAmerica.net to collect your favorite college and NFL stars. But here's what would happen there. And this is where Josh is coming from on this, and I understand why he's thinking this way. The people who say that this would ruin the regular season further, that this would further devalue the regular season, you're not thinking about how it actually works. If where you finish in your conference standings determines whether you make the playoff, well, how does that happen? How do they determine where you're finishing the conference standings? A committee doesn't get in a room and decide, we think Tennessee's the third best team in the SEC. They play some games, and Tennessee lands where they land. Alabama lands where they land. LSU lands where they land. So wouldn't that make the regular season more relevant? Because your conference games would be the thing determining whether you got into the playoff, not somebody's opinion in a room. So that is a plus for that. Now, Ari and I talked about this yesterday, and Ari's right about this. This makes your non-conference games utterly meaningless. Now, there's two ways to look at that. They can't hurt you, so you have no incentive to schedule easy there. You have extra incentive to schedule much harder. And that's one thing that these guys are talking about. The Big Ten and the SEC guys are going to be talking about, do they do a non-conference scheduling agreement where they play each other? They have teams that play each other every year. And you obviously have the SEC teams that have their ACC in-state rivals that they're going to still play. So you got that piece of it. But the negative piece of this is the conferences are so big, especially the SEC and the Big Ten, that the schedules aren't equal. Like, the difference with the NFL is everything in the NFL is designed to maintain parity. They have the draft, they have the salary cap, they have a set schedule rotation that works a certain way. When the only wiggle room they have is somebody who had a really bad year gets a little bit easier schedule the next year, and somebody who had a really good year gets a little bit harder schedule, but only a little bit. It's only a couple of games that they can play with. Indiana's schedule and Oregon's schedule, even though they played in the same league, were very different last year. In the SEC, Georgia's schedule and Missouri's schedule were very different. Georgia's schedule was much harder. Florida's schedule was much harder than Ole Miss's schedule. And that's going to happen. And you're going to get some weird ones with that many teams in each league without everybody playing each other. And it's not going to be a nefarious thing. It's going to happen at random. But it's still going to be an issue. There are going to be teams that, by virtue of having an easy conference schedule, have a better chance at the playoff than other teams who might be better but have a harder conference schedule. So there's a couple of tweaks that they can make to work with that. We can talk about that in a second. But that's where this sort of falls, and that's where I get where the folks who hate the idea are coming from. Because unless you can find a way to balance out the schedules, it's not really an objective criteria. It's more, there's a lot of luck involved. And I was thinking about this. If they had tried something like this in 2010, I think everybody would have been on board. So let me read you the conference alignments in 2010. The ACC: Boston College, Clemson, Duke, Florida State, Georgia Tech, Maryland, Miami, North Carolina, NC State, Virginia, Virginia Tech, Wake Forest. The Big Ten: Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, Michigan State, Minnesota, Northwestern, Ohio State, Penn State, Purdue, Wisconsin. The Big 12: Baylor, Colorado, Kansas, Kansas State, Iowa State, Missouri, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, Texas, Texas A&M, and Texas Tech. The Pac-10: Arizona, Arizona State, Cal, Oregon, Oregon State, Stanford, UCLA, USC, Washington, Washington State. The SEC: Alabama, Arkansas, Auburn, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, LSU, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, South Carolina, Tennessee, Vanderbilt. So if you'd have tried this in 2010 and said, we'll give 2 automatic bids to every conference, every power conference. Now, I realize the Big East was still kind of hanging on as a power conference at this point, but they'd sort of lost steam, and that's why they were moving away from the 6 BCS conferences to the Power 5. But if you suggested this idea, if you had a 12-team playoff or a 14 or 16-team playoff and said, we're going to give 2 auto bids to every league and then some at-larges, it would work great. Like, think about how much more evenly aligned all of those leagues are. Every one of them has between 10 and 12 members. In most years, you play almost everybody in the conference. There would still be a little bit of randomness in terms of conference schedules, but not really. And you could solve for that with conference championship games or play-in games at the end of the year, however you wanted to do it. That would have worked great. These bloated conferences are the reason this doesn't work now, or it seems impossible, or looks terrible, or you can't figure out how you would want it to work. You're not supposed to have an 18-team conference. You're not really supposed to have a 16-team conference. So that's part of the reason. And The problem is you're never going back to this. You're never going back to this. Producer River says the Big Ten commercial was never intended to go coast to coast. Yes, but I do like how I can overlay the Game of Thrones music to it, and it looks perfect. But yes, you're right. It wasn't. All of those conferences I didn't similar in number, 10 to 12, and they're all regional. Like the ACC stretches along the Eastern Seaboard, but it doesn't. Like the westernmost school in that bunch, I think, is Wake Forest. As crazy as that sounds, like that's as far west as it went. So it would have worked really well in that environment. I don't know that it works as well in this environment.